Welcome to Science Power Hour, the podcast where we break down the science of teaching science. I'm Heath Belcher, your guide on this journey through the fascinating world of education, innovation, and all the things you need to know to inspire the next generation of scientists. Whether you're a seasoned educator or a new teacher just setting up your lab, we've got you covered with tips, tricks, and insights that will make your classroom a place where curiosity thrives and students shine. Hello, science teachers. It's great to have you here for episode 1 of Science Power Hour. I'm your host, Heath Belcher, and today we're diving into making the science standards stick. On this episode, special guest Alysha Tench will help us unpack the new science standards for North Carolina science teachers. Whether you're navigating the latest teaching trends, looking for creative lab ideas, or just need a little inspiration to keep your passion for science alive, this is the place for you. In this episode, we tackle the tricky challenges that science teachers need to know about when looking at the new science standards. So, grab your coffee, your lesson plans, or your safety goggles, and let's get started. Welcome to Science Power Hour. I'm Heath Belcher, Associate Superintendent in Lincoln County Schools today, and we have special guest Alysha Tench, who is the Coordinator of Accountability for Lincoln County Schools, joining us to talk about science standards, the new standards here in North Carolina, and what teachers can do to help the science standards stick with students in their classrooms. So, Alysha, thank you for joining us. Excited to hear what you might have to share with unpacking a standard and understanding what a standard really means. But before we dive into looking at a standard and talking through some of that, tell us a little bit about your background.
Thank you for having me. I am born and raised Lincoln County and a proud graduate of a Lincoln County school. And then I returned here to teach middle school math and science, but predominantly middle school science for 11 years before I transitioned into administration at a local elementary school, and then I have now moved into accountability. And I am excited to support schools and help them use their data to guide their instructional practices and to make teaching and learning more refined for students as we meet their needs.
So as a student, what was your favorite subject?
I definitely leaned into the science and math classes. I was very fortunate to have some incredible science teachers who left a lasting impact on me as a child and as a professional. As I cycled back through as a teacher, I was able to work with them in the professional capacity.
Is there a particular unit, content, or a part of a science or a math classroom that you particularly enjoyed teaching?
I really enjoyed teaching microbiology, which is one of the segments of the 8th grade science curriculum. It was really neat for students to kind of see that come alive, a world that they live in every day, but they really didn't realize it. And we taught it hand in hand with COVID, so it was very relevant. Even while students were out and remote learning, there was a noticed engagement with that because it was something they were experiencing in their lifetime, which is it's not often that those big global events tie so closely to what they're learning.
When you were a student, do you remember even conversations about objectives and standards and I can statements being listed on the board? Because I don't remember any of that, but it's something now that seems to be front and center for our classroom teachers.
I remember some teachers putting like the 3-point MD 0.5 on a note card on the corner of the board, but in terms of what I learned, things that went into my science notebook or things that had an activity that really left a lasting impact were the things that I remember. I don't remember it being very like a ticket out the door kind of situation or more of a final assessment than the constant assessment of like just the quick, do they know it, are we ready to move on, like we try to do today to make sure that we're closing all those gaps and meeting all those needs.
Absolutely. And so with that, of course, in North Carolina with our new standards, there's a lot of alignment and emphasis with the NGSS, the Next Generation Standards. And our teachers are somewhat familiar with that, but because the standards are new, they're beginning to unpack some of that with this initial implementation this school year. And whenever we think about a standard, what can a teacher do to go in and really identify a key concept, a key skill that may be spelled out within a standard?
So I think, first of all, we have to think, how do we interpret this standard from the lens of a student, and what does a student need to take out of the standard as we teach it? North Carolina is very intentional with the way they've set up their science standards. They all follow a similar format, and I think if you spend time wrapping your head around how these pieces of the next gen standards and the North Carolina standards and the science and engineering practices marry together, then you can find a great groove to teach from that really challenges students, maybe challenges your teaching practices a little bit, but it makes science livable, and it's an experience really, and it leaves lasting knowledge. I think is the intention here, and the goal is for students to think and feel like scientists more than to just understand science.
And so with that, first thing that a teacher typically will see when they're unpacking that standard is a number code of some kind. So talk to us a little bit about what is that?
So that helps us kind of group science into the specific domains. So the beginning of the standard, you're going to see a PS for physical science, or an LS for life science, an ESS for earth science. That allows us to vertically align those standards and to figure out what students had prior and where students are going next. An 8th grade science teacher could go to 7th grade or 6th grade science standards and look at similar PS or LS standards to figure out where students are coming from. Then the grade level, and obviously the standard number, is following the domain sequence.
And when we're thinking about those domains, I'm making some assumptions here, but when we look at that, is it leading ultimately to those discipline-based subjects that a student will be exposed to in high school? So even if I'm a kindergarten, a 3rd grade teacher, a 7th grade teacher, so be that at primary, intermediate, middle school, ultimately that's leading up to a discipline that they'll study at high school.
Yes, they do follow that trend, so your life science skills will trickle into biology, same for your earth science. It follows that pathway, and almost the high school course is like a culmination of that learning where they really just dive deeply into that particular domain.
That vertical alignment is essential, and a teacher that's recognizing and starting to understand why it's structured that way, ultimately learning those basic skills. And so with that said, then we get after that number in a standard, we start to see usually oftentimes some verbs and some other language. Talk to us a little bit about what comes after that identifier or that number that we might see.
So the structure of the standard always begins with a science and engineering practice, and I think that's probably the biggest change in the science standards as we have moved to this new setup, is all of our content is now tied to these identified practices of what scientists can do. So, for example, if we were to take the physical science standard from 8th grade 1.4, it says to construct an explanation. Scientists should be able to construct an explanation. And there is a great graphic that's provided by the Next Gen Science standards that helps us know. They have actually even separated what that means for a K2 student, a 3.5 student, a 6.8 student, and a 9.12 student to construct an explanation in relation to a standard. And then as you progress, it says 2 or 4, some type of connection there. And then there's typically a Bloom's taxonomy verb, and it's the revised Bloom's taxonomy. The revised Bloom's taxonomy says that the base level is remember, and anything beyond remember is a challenge for students. So applying, creating, understanding, analyzing, evaluating, classifying all fall in that realm that we want students to interact with their learning and to think through and not just remember and regurgitate. And then it goes into the content of the standard. So the example I referenced earlier, the 8th grade physical science standard 1.4 says construct an explanation to classify changes in matter as a physical change or a chemical change that are the result of a chemical reaction. So the constructed explanation will be the science and engineering practice, and the classification is the Bloom's taxonomy verb there. And it all has to revolve around evaluating matter being a physical or a chemical change based off of the resulting chemical reaction.
What are some of the other science and engineering practices, that skill that may be referenced within that standard? Talk about a few of those others that a teacher might come across.
So the other practices are things like asking questions and defining problems, developing and using models. And if you look at some of the sample items that have been released, you'll see that there are a lot of graphics, models, diagrams now within those questions. So students are going to interact with more than just words of a question. They'll be looking at and evaluating data, graphics, and tables, charts in order to make decisions about science concepts, analyzing and interpreting data, just kind of like what we just talked about, using mathematics and computational thinking, constructing explanations and designing solutions, engaging in an argument from evidence is another great one where they're going to have to think beyond not just what, but also why. I definitely think it's worth time to investigate each of these practices individually because they have a hierarchy within K2, 3, 5, 6, 8, and 9, 12. You may think, okay, a third grader engaging in an argument from evidence might look one way, and really that's the way they expect a different age span to be able to do it. There's a great resources out there regarding the science and engineering practices. I particularly like the one provided by the Wonder of Science. A lot of people in the science world know Mr. Anderson and his videos and the great things that he creates, and he has done a great job on the Wonder of Science, breaking down each of those practices and giving teachers explanation and tools in their toolkits to help them provide instruction appropriately as it aligns to those practices. But I definitely think the piece that teachers need to kind of live in a little bit is that it can't be sit and get. It's going to be interacting and experiencing a little more of kind of that flipped classroom mindset where we're doing like a little mini lesson and we really spend time engaging with what the science and engineering practice is asking us to do.
And that's really interesting. And so, of course, you've mentioned a couple of resources already that a teacher can use, and we will link those for teachers to have access to within the description of this podcast episode. So, teachers, if you want to learn more and dive into a little bit further what we're talking about, we'll have those linked for you to review, to use at your leisure. And so when we're looking at, and some of the thoughts when you were talking, I was thinking about with those science and engineering practices and the progression of skills from a primary grade classroom to a high school classroom might look a little bit different. But ultimately, what are some of the alignment with the broader educational goals that we want students to develop? Perhaps critical thinking, problem solving, some of those. I mean, what does that look like in looking at those SEPs?
I really think it's challenging our students to develop the skills sequentially from kindergarten through high school, where they are able to not only know, but to interact and to actually produce, whether that be through an experiment or through a written report, through conversation, or where they can take content knowledge beyond memorization and they can actually create products from that knowledge, and it gives them skills that they can carry forward. And a lot of those skills carry beyond just the world of science. They carry into lots of opportunities. And a lot of students, I think, tend to think, oh, if I'm going to go to high school and dig into science and I'm going to graduate high school, if I want to do anything with science, I need to go on to a four-year university. But there are a lot of great opportunities for students in the world of science that expand beyond just that basic doctor, lawyer, lab tech. And I think providing these standards in this format where they are engaging with these science and engineering practices really helps open their eyes to the different ways that they can interact with science and broadens their horizon on how that can carry forward into whatever comes next after high school. The document I referenced earlier from the Next Gen Science Standards that shows this progression of student practices from K2 through 9-12 really does a great job of outlining what it means for a student to be able to engage with this practice. So for example, on the constructing explanations, a kindergarten through second grade student is expected to use information from observations firsthand, so things they experience in the classroom or from media that's shown in the classroom, to construct an evidence-based account for natural phenomena. So to me, I think of first grade teacher who is showing a video and then students are at the carpet and they're doing a turn and talk and they are explaining what occurred in what they observed, or they're doing the hands-on activity where they're balancing these paper shapes as a common first grade teacher activity, and they have to figure out how to make them balance and explain why. So that would be an observation, what is balancing and what is not, and then try to explain why it is or is not working. Versus when you move to third through fifth grade, it says to construct an explanation of observed relationships. So they're looking at how things interact with one another and trying to analyze the result of that interaction. And then when you move to sixth through eighth grade, construct an explanation that includes qualitative or quantitative relationships. So now we're really assigning the variables there that help describe the way a concept works within their evaluation of whatever standard's being taught. And then when they move to ninth and through 12th grade, they are expected to make a quantitative or qualitative claim regarding the relationship between dependent and independent variables. So it really scaffolds as they move through, starting just with the ability to make those scientific observations and explain them in kindergarten through second grade, all the way through the ability to analyze them in terms of their variables and the way those things are codependent on one another and how it impacts the results of whatever they are analyzing.
What they're producing may not necessarily be an item. It could be a claim or a thought, a piece of evidence.
Right. It definitely seems to lean into that metacognitive thinking, and for students to not only understand what, but why, how, why not, to ask deeper questions. I think that will be a part of our instructional practices that we really need to be forward-thinking with. What questions are we asking, and how are we providing students opportunities to answer questions and discuss those answers not only with the class as a whole, but in that small group setting and even in partners.
And then whenever I think engaging in argument, for example, from evidence, have conversation and dialogue about that would be a skill that I think is essential as they continue to progress through some of that.
So I think in terms of argument here, we're really looking at the process of drawing evidence-based conclusions. That's actually the way that the Next Gen Science Centers outlines what it means to engage in an argument from evidence, is to not just have an opinion one way or the other, but to be able to support it from evidence that can be observed or measured within our scientific practices. And so when we are looking at how that spans K-12, our kindergartners are supposed to just be able to start identifying arguments. Can they determine which side supports which observation or claim? And then our third through fifth graders are comparing or refining arguments based on that evaluation. And then our sixth through eighth graders, our middle school students, are critiquing two arguments on the same topic and analyzing whether they emphasize similar or different evidence based on the interpretation of the facts. And then as we move to our 9th through 12th graders, they are not only comparing and evaluating competing arguments or design solutions, so looking at the outcomes there, but also looking at the possibility of new evidence, limitations, constraints, and even ethical issues. So it's that much deeper thinking that kind of brings their own analysis and experience of what they're going through into what they're producing as they evaluate and engage in this argument. It gives them a little bit of ownership of it, but in a way that is appropriate and follows those expectations of what a scientist can do.
Can a standard really be taught? I mean, every standard, if it starts with or has one of those SEPs as part of that. So can that be used, teacher use that to better identify, okay, now how can I make this relevant to my students? How can I make this engaging for my students?
Having these science and engineering practices provide us an anchor for the way that they're expected to understand the concepts that we're teaching. And I think we'll see as these example assessments are rolled out and the released items are rolled out, that students are not just going to be able to regurgitate that knowledge or repeat it back in the way they've maybe done in the past, but they're actually going to be able to evaluate their knowledge and how it applies based on these science and engineering practices. So as a classroom teacher, I would use the science and engineering practices to kind of steer the way my instruction was going to go and the way students were going to interact with the learning in the classroom. My anchor would be the actual standard, the content of the standard, and what they needed to know as an outcome.
And I love that language of an anchor. Teachers are oftentimes tasked with more content and less time, and so it becomes so challenging for them to be able to teach all of the standards that they're expected to teach or that the students are going to be assessed on. And so teachers have a very difficult task in unpacking those standards and identifying what is essential. So naturally what happens, I feel like sometimes when it's asking us to, or a student to construct an explanation, because a teacher feels like I don't have time for students to be able to construct an explanation. Instead it's hear an explanation or memorize an explanation. And so when we're thinking about that, are there any tips, any things that you could give our teachers that are concerned about, well, I don't have time to get to all of that depth of knowledge for our students in these SEPs that we see in these new standards?
I really think it's a combination of kind of self-reflection and pushing ourselves out of our comfort zone a little bit. We're asking our students to do that by engaging with these science and engineering practices. So looking at the way we have delivered instruction in the past and determining if that's going to continue to be the best way to deliver instruction. I think it's also where that collaboration comes into play and is incredibly important, because just like our students have different strengths and weaknesses, our teachers have different things that they bring to the table, and you may find the person across the hall has a great way to construct an explanation, and it's also something that's very procedural. I think as we begin to teach students how to engage with the science and engineering practices, we need to determine the procedures that we want to put in place so that looks consistent and so that students are getting to those outcomes that we really want them to have. So it's a little bit of self-evaluation and also just a little bit of structural evaluation of the routines of the classroom, and then really leaning into that collaboration together. Because it's not meant to take away from teaching, it is meant to add to teaching.
That's very helpful when we're thinking about the challenge that teachers have with time. The other challenge that I feel like a lot of teachers have to deal with is the different ability levels that they have in their classroom. And so, for example, when we look at constructing an explanation or one of these other science and engineering practices, can a teacher differentiate a standard to help meet their students' needs? How can a standard be differentiated?
I really think there's two ways to approach that. First, we have to look at, are we eliminating barriers that may be in the way? So for a student who is a struggling reader, it might be as simple as providing read aloud for whatever we're asking them to do. If we're asking them to evaluate an article, we may just provide the opportunity to read aloud that article so that we remove the barrier of the reading comprehension and we really start to look at what do they understand about science and the science standards here. The other piece is a lot of times we can provide pieces of these outcomes for students, help them draw those connections. So if I were helping a student who really needed that additional scaffolding or support construct an argument, I may give them a sentence starter or a piece of the argument and then guide them towards the remainder of that argument to help draw that all together in a way that makes sense to them. A lot of times it's about recognizing and eliminating barriers, and that is not going to be the same for every student in the classroom.
And then the third challenge that I feel like a lot of teachers have is, so we've talked about time, the differing abilities in their classroom, and then the third one, acquisition to resources, and if it's hands-on activities, the things that they need oftentimes to take that learning to the next level. And so do you have any thoughts on what implications or how a teacher can overcome that challenge?
So I think as we begin to kind of, as the state of North Carolina, dive into these science standards and what it means for students, NCDPI is doing a great job of rolling out things on their landing page that they've created. There are resources, including sample assessment items and things there that our science curriculum leads from the state of North Carolina have helped develop. I know we're waiting on some of the accountability pieces in terms of those formal assessments with check-ins and EOGs at the end of the year here in North Carolina. But there are resources there on their Science Hub that are really valuable, help give us an idea of where we are. I also think the collaboration piece is really essential here, not only within your building, but within maybe your district or your zone. You will find teachers who have resources or have identified or located resources that are shareable, that are replicable across other classrooms. And as we begin to evaluate those together, we will determine what works well and what maybe we need to revisit. Conversation and that professional learning together is really important.
What are some of the assessment updates, anything from the world of accountability?
So in terms of assessment rollout, we have received information that the standards that are expected to be on each check-in have now been released. Those test specs are now available, but the access to that first biology check-in is now pushed back. So that is delaying teachers a little bit. I encourage you to be resilient and remember that it's a learning year for everyone, and we will make it through and we will come out the other side better for it. The other thing is just to really understand the format of the assessment and the way it has changed. If you take time to look at the sample science practice item on the student tutorial page from NC Test, or if you're on the DPI Science Hub and you go to their accountability PowerPoint that's linked there, there are two great sample items, and there are some noticeable changes in the way these items are set up compared to past assessments. It is very reading heavy. The left-hand side of the screen scrolls independently from the right-hand side of the screen, much like our reading assessments do. And there is information there that is beyond just the to-the-point question that kind of gives you background knowledge that you have to evaluate. Both sample items include graphics and charts that students are asked to evaluate. And then 5 questions are related to that one scenario or situation that they post in that setup, much like our reading passages. And so the samples that are out there show some overlapping of standards and content where students are evaluating multiple pieces of content within one scenario that's given in that setup in order to answer those 5 questions. So that's a piece I think that is most different about the assessment and something to be aware of and prepared for. If you go in and look at those 2 sample items, I think it helps wrap your head around the way they are utilizing these science and engineering practices within the assessments and asking students to think regarding those standards. So if I come to a question about a physical or chemical change for 8th grade 1.4 in the physical science standards, the questions that are asked on the assessments relate to constructing an explanation and classifying physical and chemical changes based on our ability to construct that explanation, which is exactly what the standard tells us that it's going to do.
I think your words were really important in understanding and helping our students to think like the test and to think whenever they're exposed within the classroom environment to a variety of questions and assessments that in a lot of ways are designed similar to the assessment that they're going to be expected to take at the end of the year. And so we have had a great conversation about unpacking a standard so that it will stick with students. We've talked about how sometimes it is a tricky task for a teacher to really go in and look at that. And Alysha has referenced multiple resources that can help our teachers do that, and we'll link all of those in. And she has created a one-pager that will help, that also has a lot of this information that's linked in there as well, so you have access to that. If you have not taken an opportunity to look at that a little closer, you certainly will want to do so. So Alysha, share with us a little bit about what that one-pager looks like and what they can expect to see on that.
So the one-pager that's available is specifically for 5th, 8th, and high school biology, but it is definitely applicable to all grade level science standards because the format is similar for all of them. At the top of the one-pager, you are going to see a breakdown of the standard, how they have chosen to write the standards in a way that is consistent from K to 12, that helps us know what science and engineering practice they're after as we work through that specific content strand, and also what Bloom's taxonomy verb is there, I think is very relevant to the way they may ask those assessment questions. So at the top of your one-pager, it's really just a way to break down a standard and how to wrap your head around the teaching of that standard from that format. There's also a QR code link to our draft pacing guides for Lincoln County Schools. So as we are in the process of evaluating these standards and determining changes that may need to be made to our instructional practices and pathways, this is a draft form, and we encourage you to make note and to provide feedback as we progress towards getting those into the format that we will use moving forward. On that left-hand side as well, if there was a change to the curriculum in regards to the standards, whether it be new, omitted, or revised, it is listed there as well. So, for example, high school biology had very little change apart from applying those science and engineering practices, whereas 8th grade, we see here it has 3 new standards. The standards are very close to content that we have always taught in the 8th grade. They have specified them in their own standards, and so it's definitely something worth noting. Same with 5th grade, there was a minor change, and there's changes noted there as well. There's also a great graphic for what the science and engineering practices are, and a QR code link to the Wonder of Science that I referenced earlier, where Mr. Anderson takes time to break down each of those science and engineering practices in a way that helps teachers evaluate how to utilize them in their instruction, how to determine what they're asking us to do with that strand of content as we're teaching. And then there is a little chart of assessment updates and reminders. It has changed a little bit now that they have started to roll out test specs and things, but overall, that information is still the same in regards of where to access those science item practice sets and the tools available on the NCDPI Science Resource Hub.
Thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about the standards, and I hope that we'll be able to get you to come back onto the Science Power Hour podcast again so that our once we have a little bit more information on our assessments and what that will look like, and can hopefully talk to you about how a teacher can help prepare students for those upcoming assessments and dig into that content a little bit deeper. Teachers, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Science Power Hour podcast here in Lincoln County Schools. Again, I'm Heath Belcher, the Associate Superintendent, and I want to express appreciation to Alysha Tench for jumping on and sharing her expertise with all of you on unpacking a standard. Thank you for being here. Thanks for tuning in today. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you're looking for renewal credit, be sure to fill out the form linked in the show notes. We'll catch you next time on the Science Power Hour podcast with more insights and strategies to boost your science teaching.